I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Shailendra Pratap Jain.
Trust, we believe, is the most important currency in today's business climate. And if you lose trust, it becomes really, really hard to rebuild it. So we make no bones about the fact in the book that if you have lost trust, it's going to be a battle, uphill battle. However, we believe it is possible to restore some of it in the short run and then rebuild it over the long run.
Shailendra Pratap Jain is Bret Endowed Professor of Marketing and International Business at the Foster School of Business, the University of Washington in Seattle. Well known for his widely published scholarship in consumer psychology, Dr. Jain has extensive publishing and editorial experience in top marketing journals and has won many executive and graduate MBA teaching awards. Prior to his academic career, he worked in sales, brand management, and advertising in industry and is associated with several noted marketing campaigns in India. My interview with Shailendra is coming right up. But first,
my dad works in B2B marketing, but I never really knew what that meant. Then one day my dad came by my school for career day and told everyone in my class he was a big ROAS man. Then he just kept saying things like, the bigger the ROAS, the better, over and over. My friends still laugh at me to this day. I think it means calculating a return on ad spend. One thing's for sure, I'll be known as the ROAS man's kid for the rest of my days. Why couldn't you just be a fireman or a lawyer? Why? You ruined my life, Dad.
Not everyone gets B2B, but LinkedIn has the people who do. And with ads on LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people based on job title, industry, likelihood to buy, and more. Start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Mike Carlin hosts a great podcast called Uncorking a Story. Mike, tell us what these fine folks will get when they listen.
Uncorking a Story profiles successful writers and authors to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. And it all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin?
Ooh, interesting. Where can people subscribe?
You can follow the show at uncorkingstory.com, at marketingpodcast.net, or by searching for Uncorking a Story wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard him. Go subscribe.
Shailendra, welcome to On Brand.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning. I'm so excited to be here, and I really appreciate your setting aside time to talk.
I am excited to chat. I should also reference that you have a book on the horizon as well, co-authored with your wife, correct?
That's exactly right.
And that would be Managing Brand Transgressions. So with branding, we have a lot of things to worry about. How do we know whether or not it is a transgression, so to speak?
Usually, the telltale signs are there. It starts out possibly with a small murmur or a buzz or some kind of a viral piece of information. And brands have made mistakes in the past where they interpreted it as, it's nothing to worry about, but it became a real fire in very quick order. So I think brands should keep their ears very, very close to the ground to figure out if some of their actions, which could be controversial or questionable, have the potential to become more serious transgressions.
So what is the turning point or a sign to look for to know if it's something that, is the kind of something a little more everyday versus something that is a larger transgression that's going to stay with a brand for longer?
I think today most of the well-managed brands are keeping a lookout for what kind of information is there on social media, online, and digital outlets, and so on and so forth, where consumers and other stakeholders are talking about the brand. And this is, the voice of the stakeholder, so to speak. And there are sophisticated techniques where you can create an index in this particular for this information, where you know whether the index is more negatively balanced or positively balanced. And it can be done in extremely quick time, and you know very, very quickly whether there is some negative chatter about your brand. That should be an initial flag. How rare it is, it depends on several factors, which hopefully we will get to talk about. But in our book, what we suggest is that as soon as something controversial seems to be appearing on the horizon, a brand is well advised to take some action right away.
So we often think when it comes to crisis management that timing is everything. What are those critical first steps that brands should take immediately after a transgression like this occurs?
I will respond to that really important question, Nick, with an example, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's a relatively current example. So, sometime in April or May of this year, iPad released an advertisement, and that advertisement was called Crush. And the ad showed basically a lot of traditional art objects and art creations being crushed by an industrial machinery. And at the end of that crush, visual crush, emerges the iPad. And the tagline is, I think, the thinnest iPad ever, something to that effect. I forget, my apologies. So the message was that iPad is a versatile product, the new iPad, and it can address many, it provides a lot of creative benefits to the user. However, it clearly landed not quite well on the critical target audience or target consumers, which was a creative fraternity. And the ad got an enormous amount of global backlash. And the backlash was voiced as that iPad is really talking about killing the creative industry with AI. And there is a context to it, because 2-3 years back, Hollywood screenplay writers were up in arms because of their salaries and because of the threat of AI and so on. So this ad was not seen in isolation. It had been building up, so to speak, based on that contextual event. So what Apple did was, within, I think, a day or day and a half, they withdrew the ad, apologized, and they took accountability, and they said that we were miscalibrated about the ad's intent. And they did not justify, they did not explain, they did not engage in a debate or a discussion. They simply withdrew the ad, and they went on record saying that this ad will not see light of day on television. In our assessment, we think this was a very good response that Apple took to what was perceived as a threat by several important stakeholders. So the speed of response was demonstrated by this particular example. It was what we call in the book, act with lightning speed, without, and after taking accountability of the situation. Another case, which is somewhat dated by today's standards, was 2019, I think, when Starbucks, one of its outlets in Philadelphia, a barista in that outlet basically called the cops on 2 Black young customers because they hadn't placed an order for a very, very long time. And this event literally caught fire on the internet, and there was a lot of pushback, as you would expect. And the speed with which Starbucks responded, we cover that in great detail in this book. First of all, the CEO apologized, I think 6 or 7 times, including in public, on television, on Facebook. And then he flew to Philadelphia, spoke to these young customers, talked to the community, and created a plan, which was, they settled with these customers in private. And then the company decided to shut down all its stores in the United States for diversity, equity, and inclusion training for every one of its employees. So these 2, in my opinion, are modern day gold templates of how to respond to perceived transgressions, and with what speed.
Well, the speed is important. And I also think, in both of those examples, but especially the one from Apple, you mentioned that, makers, creators are such an important part of Apple's constituency. And really, it is kind of a core to the brand ethos. I think the Steve Jobs vision of the company was always kind of sitting at the intersection of arts and technology. And when you literally show the arts being crushed by your technology, it is a it cuts core to what the brand is supposed to be all about. So definitely kind of important to notice kind of what's in the DNA of why some of these, and Starbucks as well, supposed to be a welcoming space. And when you do things that run counter to that, they are, I was going to say violations, but then I remembered the title of the book. They are transgressions to who you are. So you talked a bit about kind of some of the best practices, what we should do. But what about the other side of that and those that step in it in their response? What are some of the common pitfalls that brands should avoid?
Yeah. A brand exists in an ecosystem, and that ecosystem comprises of multiple stakeholders: consumers, employees, regulators, activists, and of course, lots and lots of different stakeholders. So brands sometimes, in our experience, and we cite quite a few case studies of brands which we think made a mistake in terms of their response. Sometimes they ignore certain critical stakeholders, even if that perceived transgression is not the brand's fault or responsibility. So the case that we talk about is that of Maggi Noodles, which is a big brand in India. It's an instant noodle brand made by Nestle. And the story goes that Maggi was purportedly having more MSG in its product than legally permitted, and which could potentially lead to some health issues. And as you said, that the core consumer segment that they were targeting were the children in the family. Parents were, of course, the buyers and the decision makers, but children were the one who were consuming this product. So the urgency was, twice as amplified because of the health-related concerns. Now, Nestle did not have excess MSG, as it was proven later. However, I think they did two things, in our opinion, which could have been done differently. Number one, in our understanding, they took the regulators in India head on, by which I mean the regulators had done their testing and they said there is excess MSG. Nestle said, no, there isn't. We will do our own testing. And unfortunately, this created a conflict between the regulators and Nestle. So this was one problem, I think, which Maggi faced. And the second one was that they responded, in our judgment, quite slowly. So we are talking in what we call, we are talking in an information democracy, an age of information democracy. And information travels literally at lightning speed today. And countries have been known to have been affected by the speed with which communication takes place. And Nestle took a long time to respond. They probably, in our judgment, they probably were feeling like deer in headlights, considering that they did not believe they had a problem in their product. So these two responses, one taking the regulators head on, second responding really, really slowly, led to a significant market share loss for the brand, and the whole category shrank as a consequence because Maggi had almost 70 or 80% market share. And it took almost 5 years for Maggi to, for the dust to settle down and for consumers to realize and understand that Maggi is not a bad brand after all. However, their market share has still not returned to the super dominant levels that they had 5 years back. So it's not just about a real transgression. It's also about a perceived transgression, and you don't really say, "I'm not hurting the consumer, therefore I can not take too much either responsibility or treat this as too serious an issue. It can be because of other stakeholders. So the one thing is, don't ignore other stakeholders and also respond quickly as possible. Then there was another case which was for a brand called Snow Milk products in Japan. It's kind of a forgotten case, but it was quite a telling case in our understanding, where Snow Milk had basically, it was ultimately attributed to Snow Milk's production, so they were at fault. It led to food poisoning, and something like 12 to 15,000 consumers fell very, very sick. Snow Milk started basically, stonewalling everything. They said, this is not our fault. We are totally clean. And they never accepted responsibility. They never took even accountability. And they kept pushing back on all the allegations against them, not realizing that sooner or later, the truth will come out, because investigators will get to the bottom of the situation. You're talking about consumers falling sick in the thousands. And so all the misrepresentations and deception and not taking accountability, responding slowly, and at times even hushing up the data, destroying evidence, the company ultimately shut down and it was merged with another organization.
On Brand will be right back after this.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on Impian to help your business? Mike Carlin hosts a great podcast called Uncorking a Story. Mike, tell us what these fine folks will get when they listen.
Uncorking a Story profiles successful writers and authors to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. And it all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin?
Ooh, interesting. Where can people subscribe?
You can follow the show at uncorkingstory.com, at marketingpodcast.net, or by searching for Uncorking a Story wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard him. Go subscribe. You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Christy Heiler hosts a fantastic podcast called Own It. Christy, tell us more about the show.
Own It is all about celebrating women and non-binary advertising agency owners. We talk about buying out of the boys' club of advertising because less than 1% of ad agencies are owned by women.
And where can people subscribe?
You can find the podcast at untilyouownit.com. We're also on the Marketing Podcast Network at marketingpodcast.net. And of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Now, back to the show.
So then the third one that I'd like to share, if I may, is a more recent one, which was in China. Dolce & Gabbana, the famous Italian luxury brand, they were quite successful in having China open their doors to this brand, and which was, sheer luck of the draw, and they really lucked out. However, again in 2019, they had a big show, a fashion show, where they were inviting 1,200 celebrities and 350 to 400, fashion influencers. To create some excitement around the show, the brand released 3 advertisements before the show. And in those advertisements, they showed a very beautiful Chinese lady who's dressed in traditional Chinese clothes with beautiful jewelry, who's trying to eat Italian food with chopsticks. And there's a woman who's at the center, and there's a male voiceover who's telling her how to eat with chopsticks. And I think the listener should see these ads for themselves to really understand, because these 3 ads landed on the Chinese consumers as extremely inflammatory, misogynistic, and racist. And the outcome of that was that Dolce & Gabbana lost about 20% footing in China by way of their stores closing down. Most of the online retailers withdrew the brand from their shelves, and every single celebrity dissociated from the brand. And even now, Dolce & Gabbana has not been able to have the same presence in China as they did before these 3 ads. So this is what we call a principle of treating each life with dignity. and certainly not talking down to people and telling them how to live their lives. So these are three examples where the brand either mistook the context, misunderstood the context, as in Maggie, and responded slowly, or as a snow milk case where there was clear deception and covering up evidence, and in the case of Dolce and Gabbana, where the communication landed on the viewers and the listeners as being arrogant, misogynistic, and racist, which was really indignifying the population. So these are some of the mistakes that we cite in the book, and we carve them out as principles to follow when you face a transgression.
Those are compelling examples. And again, as someone that also spends time in the college classroom, I know that examples of what not to do can be very effective. When we talk about the brand impact, the consumer impact, a lot of this comes back to the decision making. What role does leadership play in managing brand crises effectively?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And our seventh principle is leadership sets the tone. So, in our understanding, the DNA of a transgression resides in the leadership. And the leadership pretty much carves out a culture in the organization. And the very simple observation is when the leaders say jump, people jump. When leaders say let's smile, people smile. That's pretty much how many organizations work in terms of cultural assimilation based on leadership's signals. So, in the leadership domain, we talk about the case of Boeing and Volkswagen. Now, Volkswagen was known for the latest, the recent information about Volkswagen's emission cheating scandal is all over the internet. And the CEO at that time denied that he had any information about the emissions cheating scandal. Just to share with the listener, in case they are not aware, Volkswagen had installed these devices which reported emissions lower than they actually were, because this enabled them to get over some regulations, particularly in some of the Western countries. So the leader denied that he had any information, and later on, New York Times exposed an email or a set of emails where it was known to the leader that this emissions cheating device costs very, very little and it can underreport emissions. And right now, unfortunately, that gentleman is being sought for criminal misconduct in several parts of the world. So that is a sliver of an example of how leadership influences culture. And then we also talk about Boeing, in which case, when Boeing had the two 737 MAX crashes, its CEO at that time basically attributed the crashes to poor training or lack of following protocol by the pilots of the two affected airlines, Ethiopian Airlines and Indonesian Airlines. So I know this is kind of a bit of a stretch, but when the CEO gives these kinds of interviews in the press and communicates what he or she or they think the situation is, the entire organization pretty much probably absorbs that message and starts communicating that message down the line, because they take that as an implicit signal of what story to communicate. We know that CEO was asked to leave, and we also know that since then, two CEOs have come. One of them is the new CEO who's now taking over from the current CEO. And so, yeah, leadership is huge. Leadership plays a huge role. And we believe that the DNA for transgression really resides in the leadership. We also talk about a stellar case, which was jaw-dropping for us, to be perfectly honest, in our research. You might have heard, or listeners might have heard, of the terrorist attack in a hotel in Mumbai called the Taj. And that terrorist attack was, it killed hundreds of people, and the hotel was affected. They burned down part of the hotel, and so on and so forth. The hotel's story is that 10 of its employees died in that attack. Most of them died while trying to save the hotel guests. This is a case written by a professor And the case is about leadership and how these employees imbibed the lesson that the leaders have given over decades and decades of their presence in the Indian marketplace, which is to treat the customer as God. And this is the leader's influence which led to the ultimate sacrifice by 10 employees, or most of them. So yeah, there are some examples which clearly demonstrate how important the leadership is to an organization, not only in the extent and frequency of transgression, but in how it is managed and how the corporation responds to it.
Wow, that's such a great, powerful example there as well. So, as we talk about all of this, what can brands and leaders do to rebuild trust in the wake of a transgression?
Yeah, trust, we believe, is the most important currency in today's business climate. And if you lose trust, it becomes really, really hard to rebuild it. So we make no bones about the fact in the book that if you have lost trust, it's going to be a battle, uphill battle. However, we believe it is possible to restore some of it in the short run and then rebuild it over the long run. So, the manner in which the transgressing brand responds to a transgression in the short run is significantly predictive of whether and to what extent trust gets restored. So, the first thing we talk about is if your brand is perceived to have transgressed, immediately respond to the victim's pain and hurt. The knee-jerk reaction for most corporations is we need to protect the brand, we need to protect the stockholders, the shareholders, equity, and we need to protect our corporation and profits. And we understand the corporation exists for profit mostly, unless they are not for profit. And without profit, corporations cannot succeed. They cannot have competitive advantage. We understand, but when you are faced with this situation where the rubber hits the road and you have perceived to have transgressed, responding to the victim immediately creates a virtuous cycle in terms of the future of your response. The whole company, the whole corporation knows that the victim comes first. The world knows that the brand has responded by serving to protect the victim as much as the brand can. This could be by way of an apology. This could be by way of visiting the victims. This could be by way of quick and transparent acknowledgement of the transgression, that we are at fault. Most victims are confused. Why did this happen? Who's at fault? Many victims, of course, blame the brand, and that may not be accurate calibration. But when brands take the confusion away from the victim and say, oops, we made a mistake, we take accountability, even if we are not responsible, and we will do our best to address your concerns, that sets everything in motion, in our opinion. After that, be transparent. Transparency is not negotiable in today's day and age, particularly when you have all kinds of fake and non-fake news, which is floating around at the drop of a hat. We are talking about digital democracy. We are not talking about newspaper and radio democracy, which used to be 30, 40, 50 years back. Be transparent. Take accountability, even if you're not at fault, and put principle over profit. We say profit will come. Profit is critical. We are not dissing profit, but don't worry about a few $1,000,000 in the process. You might be compromising your whole corporation potentially if you don't act swiftly, which is the fifth principle, which is act with lightning speed. And then we also talk about treat each life with dignity that I communicated with you, specific to Dolce & Gabbana. Then leadership sets the tone. And one long-term idea that we share in the book is to build brand authenticity. Authenticity is, it's an amorphous idea, and lots of people have defined authenticity in different ways. We define authenticity as delivering on the promises you make without compromise. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Just don't compromise on the promises you're making. And as simple as it may sound, some people may say, what's the big deal? It is a big deal, because when you make a promise, be sure you can deliver it. To be sure, you need to do product development, you need to do product testing, all kinds of, important things you have to do in the product, then you need to make sure your advertising and your communication is absolutely transparent and true, and it's not, exaggeration or manipulation. Your pricing, your distribution, and your brand presence, all of it should smack of this is a brand I can trust. So yeah, it is going to be a long process, but it is possible. And we have seen in the case of many, many brands that have recovered a significant proportion of their trust. Coming back to Maggi noodles in India, I don't believe they have recovered all their trust, but they have recovered a truckload of trust. If they had responded faster and they had not taken regulators head on, our best guess is that it might not even have gone to this extent. So that's the roadmap that we outline in the book.
Well, certainly the whole process makes me smile, keeping promises. It has now come time for me to keep a promise that I told you about early on of asking you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia. I'm sorry, I'm double dipping here. So Patagonia makes us smile because in our assessment, and we don't profess to understand every single brand on the planet. There are literally millions of them. Patagonia, in our opinion, is one of the most authentic brands on the planet as far as we understand. They have kept their promises, starting with Mr. Shunad's original vision of creating a brand which is not going to hurt the planet even a small bit. And he took a lot of hits in the process. And recently we learned that he has said that after I pass away, I want to give all the money from the company towards a sustainability effort. So usually we give money away to our children, and that's fine. We do that. But he has built authenticity even in his will for the brand. So that brings a lot of smile to our face. Not because it's sustainability, but because it's a social initiative. No. It's because of his authenticity from the birth of the brand till literally the time that he says he passes away. Ben & Jerry's brings a smile to our face because in our understanding, it's one of the brands which is constantly fighting against indignifying human beings. It's always building dignity at every level of human existence. Every small segment of consumers, they do not treat any consumer as marginal. That's our understanding, which is revealed through their activism, through the names of their flavors, through their employee benefits, through their brand strategy. Everything it is reveal that they really, really, really treat human beings with great amount of respect and dignity.
Great brands, great stories, great examples to learn from. Speaking of learning from, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
So my professional website is through my school, which is my employer. And my employer is Foster School of Business. And my name is Shailendra Pratap Jain. I have also given a LinkedIn link that could be of use as well in disseminating information. I would also like to share the professional link of my co-author. And lastly, I would like to give the link for the book, which is currently on Amazon.com and several other platforms.
Awesome. Well, as promised, we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which listeners can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Shailendra, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thank you, Nick. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm so happy we could talk.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on Impian to help your business? Mike Carlin hosts a great podcast called Uncorking a Story. Mike, tell us what these fine folks will get when they listen.
Uncorking a Story profiles successful writers and authors to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. And it all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin?
Ooh, interesting. Where can people subscribe?
You can follow the show at uncorkingstory.com, at marketingpodcast.net, or by searching for Uncorking a Story wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard him. Go subscribe.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.